it nice and easy. It's gonna be
A lot of the buildings we're going to see tonight are really favorites of mine, but haven't been on the tour. A couple of them have been on the tour, but most of them haven't been on the tour before, and I just wanted to make sure that they got on the tour because they're nice buildings. The house behind me is the Samuel Rodman Jr. house, built in 1828. The Rodmans were one of the primary families that brought the whaling industry to New Bedford in the late 1700s, and by the early 1800s here in New Bedford, it was a thriving industry. The Rodman family, was primary among the whalemen that invested in the industry, that had ships all over the place, and Samuel Rodman Jr. was one of them. He's a very interesting guy in history because he wrote a very detailed diary of his life and the comings and goings in New Bedford from 1820 to 1859. And so much of the day-to-day life and even major events in the city at the time were described in detail by Rodman. Sometimes he was involved in lots of those events as well. So he's an interesting guy. He built this house for himself, actually, maybe even designed it. It's a classic style. It's a little bit different from as far as the siding is concerned, but this square three-story, plain mansion-style house here was sort of the go-to house in New Bedford in the early years of the city's development during the whaling industry. The Mariners home in the historic district, the yellow house right across the street from the Whaling Museum, is another one of those big, giant three-story houses. Another example similar to this is a lot later than that. That was in the 1790s. But nonetheless, a lot of houses were built in this three-floor style, square boxes, really, not much ornamentation. It was the lack of ornamentation and style in these houses was always attributed to the fact that they were Quakers. All of these people were wealthy for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, they were Quakers. They had a very, very simple outlook on life. But when it came to business, it was all business. They made a lot of money whaling and so forth. So he was one of those guys. Now, I'm going to tell. I have lots of stories about Rodman. I've been at this house for lots of tours over the years, and this particular story is interesting to me because I did an article once for the newsletter of the Preservation Society on when running water came to the city. For 10 years in the 1860s, the city passed ordinances, raised the money to pipe all the houses that were extant at that time with running water. They built a dam in Acushnet to store most of the water. They had reservoirs where Hayden McFadden School is now. That's where the pumping station was. They had a couple of reservoirs. Anyway, it took them 10 years to do this particular job. And I did a lot of studying on it just to see how it worked out. So when it was finished in 1869, December of 1869, and I figured, I'm going to look at the newspaper because this must have been front page news. Running water, that's a big deal. There was access to water and sewage was not easy before this time. So it was a big deal. So I looked at the newspaper to see, how big a deal it would have been. Did they celebrate this? No. It was back page news. And the reason it was back page news, because Samuel Rodman Jr. was front page news. He owned the New Bedford Fairhaven Bridge at the time. It was a wooden bridge, and he owned the rights to the bridge because he charged tolls to go back and forth. You had to pay to go back and forth on the bridge. It was a big moneymaker for him. Well, in September of 1869, a huge hurricane came to New Bedford and wiped out the bridge. Made a big pile of the wooden bridge just beyond the bridge. It allowed ship traffic to go back and forth, but the bridge was gone. Well, 3 or 4 months later, Rodman hadn't done anything about it. He was like 75 years old at the time, and either he didn't want to pay the money to fix it or whatever it was. He didn't do anything. And in December, they decided, the state decided, told the city, you have to do something about this bridge, because it needs to be done. There was always ferry service from New Bedford to Fairhaven. You could take a ferry back and forth from downtown, like at the foot of Union Street, and a ferry over to Fairhaven. But the bridge was really the main way that people got back and forth. So the state came down to the city and said, do something about this bridge. You have to do something about this bridge. And so what they did, they didn't force Rodman to fix it up or anything. The city just decided to buy the rights to the bridge from Rodman for $20,000. He didn't do anything really to fix the bridge, but they bought the rights to the bridge for $20,000 and built another wooden bridge, not the ones that's there now. That one that's there now is old enough. It's from around 1900, but this is one of the bridge that was replaced. Anyway, it's an interesting story. That was front page news. The fact that we had running water in the city and so forth was not front page news, but that bridge story was. It kind of always tickled me that they did. Actually, the next street over is called School Street. And the very first fire for the fire department with the new running water was a house fire on School Street. And the headline said, the hydrants worked well. So it all worked out one way or the other. Yeah, actually, the city paid Rodman for the rights $20,000, and they built another bridge to replace it for $45,000. So the city was out $65,000 for a bridge that really, and it was free after that. There were no more tolls. It was a free bridge. So that's my little story about Rodman here and his adventure with the Bedford Fairhaven Bridge. Out behind me is a national landmark. That's the highest award that the country gives to a property. And this because Frederick Douglass came to this house, actually not this house a little bit later, but this site. This is where Frederick Douglass came when he escaped from slavery in the 1830s and lived for a while with his wife and had a few children here in Bedford as well. He went on to be, he worked on the docks for a few years or for a short time. And he went to the local African church, and he was recognized as an outstanding orator. And he was promoted by the other Quaker people in town who realized he was talented. He had a good story to tell, and he became one of the primary voices of the abolitionist community in the years before the Civil War, and then after the Civil War. He was one of the most important civil rights leaders, maybe the most important civil rights leader in the country. So this is where you're going to start here, really, after escaping from slavery in the middle 1830s. The Preservation Society is going to do a tour on this topic in detail in September of this year, September 27th. It's on the card. If you got the card from Pat, it's on the card. And I would encourage you to go to that because I think it's Jan DeSilva is going to be doing that particular tour, and she's very knowledgeable about all the houses in this area, which is referred to as Abolitionist Row, for that tour. Now, I'm doing a tour later on in the summertime on the Civil War in New Bedford. It's in July. And I have a little story about the Douglass family that pertains to the Civil War. Frederick Douglass's son Lewis was enlisted in the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry when that was formed in 1863 after the Emancipation Proclamation. He served in the 54th, and he was at the Battle of Fort Wagner, the very famous fort, battle that they fought outside of Charleston, South Carolina in the summer of 1863. It was a terrible defeat for the Union forces. It was a combination of the 54th and a number of other units that tried to attack this fort, and they were really kind of routed in the battle. And Lewis Douglass was one of the participants, and he wrote a letter home to his wife right after the battle, which is very interesting. You can read that letter online. That's where I saw it. Lewis Douglass, Civil War, or Frederick Douglass. You could read his letter. It's very cool because he says he says to his wife that he wasn't hurt badly, or he wasn't hurt at all. Although some of the other sources say that he was in fact wounded in the battle. But anyway, he talks about rushing the fort and bullets whizzing by him left and right, and men all around him falling down. Other people who were at the battle said they mowed us down like grass, when they started to attack the fort. But Lewis tells his wife, I don't know how it happened, but I wasn't hurt in the action. We assaulted. I was part of the gang that assaulted the fort. I was part of the gang they were shooting at us like crazy, and I was part of the gang that ran back when we had to retreat, and I wasn't hurt at all. So he was lucky, but his description of the action is pretty harrowing, and probably and I say it's online. The whole letter is online. His letter to his wife after the battle at Fort Wagner. And interesting story. He was wounded at some point in his service. The 54th had another big battle in Florida, which was also interesting, but a loss. And I think he would have been wounded there because he was discharged not long after that because of his wounds. He was unable to really continue, even though he was healing. He wasn't able to continue as a soldier, so he was able to get an honorable discharge. Anyway, a little bit of story about the Douglass family here. Oftentimes, the building is open for tours on AHA night. If you want to see the building on the inside, obviously it's not tonight, but if you want to see this building inside, just look at their website. It's the New Bedford Historical Society, and they'll have the hours for tours of this particular building. The house behind us is one of my favorite architecturally, because this house is a specific style in spades. It was called the stick style of architecture, or modern Gothic in its day, but it was referred to by a architectural historian in the 1950s, this style, as the stick style, and it stuck. So anyway, you can see why it's called the stick style. All these brackets, everything in gray is ornamentation that's applied to the house. It's not structural. It's made to sort of mimic what the structure might be in the inside, but it's not structural. And these king posts here in the porch and so forth, very, very steep roof line. This is the definition of the stick style. Very, very. This is a textbook house in this particular style. You can see that obviously the ceiling heights in this building must be very tall. They got to be at least 11, 12 feet, if not more. Because look how tall you can tell how tall it is. And the very steep roof line, probably a third floor that's usable for living space, I'm sure, on this particular site. Now this house is kind of shoehorned into this lot, actually, because it's a pretty big building. I'm not sure if it was a fire here that took out another house at some point, or there was just a vacant lot because it was connected to the church's land or something. But anyway, it's kind of really wedged into this site. But it's a really, really interesting house architecturally. One of my favorites, Victorians in the city, even though it's not the grand Victorian like we see in other parts of the city, but still a very, very cool house. It kind of needs a little bit of TLC at this point, but still, all the elements are there to rehab this place into a really beautiful building. I think I would take those trees out. 1870, this building was built. It's one of the beauties of the whaling era. 1830s. The Allen brothers were big-time whalers in New Bedford for a long time, and they built two houses side by side. The one right behind this house, the Old Elks Club, was another Allen brother. Both houses were built about the same time, 1830. And there's so many great details about this house, especially if you look at the ends, the parapet design in the end with the chimneys connected by that bridge between them. It's just really cool design. Very, very Nantucket-like. If you've been to Nantucket and seen some of their historic houses, they have that parapet type roof on the ends. And the house is, the basic form of the house is like a federal, or really a continuation of the colonial two-story Georgian style, but they have gone modern with the front door. You can see that the front door has all kinds of Greek style. So the Greek Revival was starting to be popular in the United States and in New Bedford as well during the time when this house was built. So the rest of the house is sort of an older style, but then they built these fantastic columns, beautiful work over the the brackets and so forth, but they still have the fanlight, which is more of a colonial or federal style building on the second floor. So many nice details in this house that really it's magnificent. There's 3 or 4 or 5 of them in this neighborhood. There's a couple more on 7th Street further down. The Allen House is not exactly like this, but very similar as well. This is really one of the big gems of the city. During the 19th century really until the Great Depression, some of the wealthiest people in the city lived in this house. Next week, we're going to, it's going to be our annual VIP tour, and one of the VIPs that I'm going to talk about, his family lived in this house during the wintertime. So it was a house that was really one of the prime real estate properties in the city. Now it's a rooming house, unfortunately, really, but it's still kept in good shape on the outside. Really, they've managed to keep all the beautiful detailing all around the house. Now, as I said, it was the Prescott family and the Bryants that lived in this house in the early 20th century, probably until maybe even the 40s, 1940s. And when they moved out, other interests bought both houses. I think the Elks bought their house, and somebody else bought this house to convert it to apartments. So they dug out the back. When we go around back, you'll see a driveway back there. So when they dug out the spaces between the houses, they found tunnels. They think they were abolitionists or Underground Railroad tunnels to hide people from people who were looking for them from the South. They found tunnels between the two houses. Very, very interesting. The lady that wrote the memoir on the Prescotts mentions it pretty specifically. When they did it, it was around, I think, 1940 when they dug up the backyard to put a new driveway in, which is, you'll see it when we go back, and they found all these old tunnels probably from the abolitionist period. This is a beautiful house here. I think it's recently changed hands. I think it just sold for $470,000, I think it was. Anyway, it's a beautiful building. I always liked this house because its form was similar to a house that I had in New Bedford on Madison Street. It's 2.5 stories. It's what they call the French Second Empire style. Anytime you see the mansard roof, that's what everybody's going to call it, French Second Empire style. But you can tell it's later than the 1860s and more like the 1870s by the columns on the front porch here. If you see those columns, and they're not classical columns, round ones that are fluted or plain, but square with the edges chamfered, or you see how the edges are cut at an angle? That's a column style from the 1870s. When you see that column style, that in the columns are clearly old, that means you don't even have to find out how old it is, 1870, because it was popular for a very short time, about 10 or 15 years, and so this house is sort of a mixture of styles. The form is kind of, and it has dental work as well, which is kind of, it's just like a lot of houses, it's a mixture of styles, and there's only a few, like the stick style house we saw, that was pure stick style, there was nothing else but stick style. But most architecture is a whole combination of things, and this is kind of an interesting example, a beautiful example of it. I have not been inside this house. I'd love to get inside this house just to see what it looks like. I'm sure there's spectacular woodwork in this building, especially from the 1870s. I'm sure the handrails and the various living quarters and stuff are quite beautiful because that's what they did at those times. But I have not been in this house to see it. The one right behind you and this one here. But let's do the one right behind you first. These are both houses that were built during the growth of the textile industry. And the original owners of both of these houses were what they call millmen, men who ran the mills. The one here is kind of a house that's very similar to a lot of houses in New Bedford, the Foursquare. Although it has a lot of interesting ornamentation on this particular house. It has a lot of, I don't know the architect of this house, but I think what the architect did was just, dress up a simple Foursquare with some nice arts and crafts detailing. the brackets underneath the roof line, the nice way that they put the leaded glass windows everywhere, the really unusual ornamentation over the doorway there. They're arts and crafts details that dress up a house. It's just a nice square box, but it's done nonetheless. It's a very attractive house, and they have a little bit of yard here, which is kind of unusual for New Bedford. So it's a very cool house. The original builders of this house and owners of this house were the Kerr family, Kerr, a very, very important family in the textile industry, not only maybe even less so in New Bedford than in other cities. The big Kerr family that owned mills in Fall River and other cities. It was just a big, an important family. The Kerr that lived in this house was a assistant treasurer at the Butler Mill. The Butler Mill was in the South End. It's on Ruth Street, Cleveland Street, those streets there. There's one remnant of the Butler Mill. Butler Mill was a big, giant operation at one time. Most of it's gone now. And he was one of the treasurers there. Now the house behind me, this is one of my favorite buildings because of this fabulous porch on the front here. It just is a spectacular building. The design of this building is almost unique in New Bedford. And it's not unique in other cities. Not other cities have, but this is not a design that you see a lot of in New Bedford. The architect was a Providence man by the name of Hilton, built in 1895. But you can see the great deal of special details, but especially this magnificent porch that sticks out here. It dominates, but it's so beautiful, really. This is just a great house. They have this big gable, this huge expansive roof in the front here, all original slate. This is from 1895, so that slate roof is a long time up there, 100 and some odd years. And it still looks like it's in decent shape, actually. The house has been red for a long time, but you can see it's in tip-top condition. This is really one of the true gems of the city. I just wish they would paint that porch, because it looks like it's a nice porch, well done, but it sort of needs to be painted. Yeah, it needs to be painted. It doesn't look finished yet. But other than that, one of the men who lived in this house for a long time was an Australian. His name was Alexander Kerwin. They were recruiting men with expertise in textiles from anywhere they can get them. And Alexander Kerwin was an Australian who was one of the superintendents at the Beacon Mill, which was in the North End. The last remnant of the Beacon Mill is the Sid Wainer warehouse out there by the train tracks. If you're familiar with the Sid Wainer building, that's the last remnant of the Beacon Mill. Very famous weaving facility. Owned 13 acres of weave shed out there in that part of New Bedford. And Kerwin was one of those managers of that mill during those years. The house behind me is a beautiful building. It's a brick Italianate style from the 1850s. A whaling merchant by the name of Benjamin Cummings had this building built. See the nice detailing on this building. One of the few buildings of the Italianate style that doesn't have a cupola. Most of them have a cupola. I'm not sure if this house had a cupola once and it was removed, or it just never had one. There's not too many houses of this style that don't have a cupola. This one is one of them. But you could see the beautiful detailing. This is typical of the Italianate style, that half-round windows. Sometimes they have round fluted columns, but in this particular case, they have square fluted columns. Paired brackets in the eaves, a lot of woodwork, and a lot of work went into building the outside. One of the few remaining brick Italianates. There's lots of wooden ones, a whole lot of wooden ones in New Bedford. There were a few other brick ones here at one time. A couple of them have been torn down. But anyway, this is a nice house. I wanted to show this house because it's kind of hidden here on this corner. It was on a holiday house tour a few years ago. It's nice on the inside. At that time, it was a nice house on the inside, beautiful space and so forth. But at that time, they had recently done a remodel. If anybody remembers this, if they've been on that tour, they had recently done a remodel. And all the countertops, and there was a lot of countertops, were like Kelly Green. Oh, geez. Kelly Green granite. It was, if you used it sparingly, It would have been beautiful, but it was everywhere. It was everywhere. And you know, they took it out a couple years later. I think they had just done it when we had the tour. I don't think it was that old. I think it was only a couple of years old at most when we went in there for the tour. Where's Pat? She probably remembers that. She's doing something. If anybody remembers that tour, it was only a few years. Did you go to that tour, Brian? Yeah, Brian. Did you go to that tour that year? Did you go on the Christmas tour when you?
I don't think we ever got into it.
Oh, okay. Anyway, a couple of years later, I didn't go in a couple of years later, but they said that oh, by the way, the green granite's gone. So they took it out. It was overwhelming, really. I mean, individual, if it was just a small portion, it was, oh, what a beautiful, they had a huge kitchen and it was just full of green. But the other spaces in the house are really nice. They have beautiful fireplaces, like you see that if you've been in the James Arnold mansion, there's beautiful marble fireplaces inside. It's just a beautiful building overall. The other house I want to point out, if it's important on this street, is the one right across the street here, the Gothic Revival. That was built in the 1840s by another member of the Rodman family, Samuel W. Rodman. Actually, it's not Samuel Rodman Jr.'s son. It's the William Rodman that owned the big granite house just a few blocks from here. It was his son. And he built this house in 1840. If you're familiar with the other Greek Gothic revivals in New Bedford, they have that tremendous detail in the gable of the barge board. This used to have that. I have a picture of it that maybe we can put that on the video so you can see what it looked like with that decoration in the gables. Beautiful building. Again, a lot of this style of Gothic revival were built of stone. There's a lot of them in the Hudson River Valley. That's where most of the models for this type of house are situated in now, in Rhinebeck and some of those other towns, just from Tarrytown, for 50 miles or so north of New York City, right on the Hudson River on the east side. There's a lot of houses like this, and most of them are made of stone. This is kind of a rough stone, actually. Sometimes they try to make it as smooth as they can, but they use kind of a rough stone in this house. Really nice house. Most of the basic size of the house is as is, except for this, probably that entrance over there, but that's basically the size of the house. I've been in the inside of this house, and it has been modified a lot for non-residential purposes. So it doesn't have much antique charm anymore. A little bit. There's some woodwork that's still there. But a lot of the Victorian charm of the building is gone. Still has a slate roof. That might be a replacement around 1900, I would say. Yeah. I would say that the green roof is a style of slate that was put on the houses around 1900 and after, actually. The house we just went to, the 1895 house with this green slate, that would be original. But this house probably had a gray slate roof. Wow. More traditional, because that was what was being put on the house. It's possible it's the original wood. You see there's a few gray slates up there?
Yeah.
That's probably what the color looked like originally.
Okay.
I would say that was probably replaced around 1900 or so. Thank you. Thanks for coming to
Thank you. Okay.
Sure.
I guess
Let's take it nice and easy. It's gonna be so easy for us to fall